Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
When we transform Nebraska corn into ethanol, it doesn't disappear from the food supply. It just takes a little detour. Ethanol is made from the starch. The rest of the corn becomes livestock feed to create meat and dairy products, corn oil, sweetener, and other food ingredients, and maybe a little carbon dioxide to make your soft drinks fizzy. Homegrown ethanol helps satisfy America's hunger for energy and the world's appetite for feed and food. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Frayne Olson looks at the beginning of the U.S. harvest. Bryce Anderson discusses the potential for a shift to La Niña. Greg Ibach outlines policy issues at the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture annual meeting in Lincoln. And Bryce Anderson talks about alfalfa winterizing. North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson is our grain market analyst this week. The country's farmers have harvested 9% of this year's corn crop and 4% of this season's soybeans. Both lag behind the 5-year average pace. U.S. growers have planted 17% of their winter wheat. Nebraska leads the nation with 45% in the ground. We talked with Frayne Thursday morning about the beginning of the U.S. harvest, the USDA's upcoming quarterly grain stocks report, and the pace of winter wheat planting.
Winter wheat is just getting rolling now. The last crop progress report showed about 17% of the winter wheat crop had been planted. The question the market's trying to answer is, given the low prices we see right now at the elevator, how many acres of winter wheat is actually going to go into the ground? We won't know that for quite a while. But first indication will be in January when we get some survey numbers back out of USDA. So we're going to be watching those reports, trying to figure out how is the planting progress growing and get a general sense, at least guesstimates on what the acreage might be. And again, we are expecting winter wheat acres to be down. The question is how much.
That's winter wheat, Frayne. What about spring wheat that's in the ground, especially up in that area?
Yeah, we're basically finishing up the tail end of spring wheat harvest here in the northern plains. The Canadian crop is starting to come off the fields. They're making some progress, but there's been some rain delays. One of the things we're starting to see or hear more in the marketplace, especially for the durum crop, but also for the spring wheat crop, is we have some disease issues starting to show up. And because of the disease issues, some of those bushels are now going to end up in the feed pile instead of in the milling quality pile. And that's the early reports coming out of the quality for the spring wheat and durum crop in Canada is kind of the same thing, that yes, they have some bushels that are in really good shape, but there's a larger percentage than normal. It's showing up as having some disease issues. And the market is paying attention to that. They are a little bit concerned about how much of this disease issue is going to cause problems along the way.
One of the big topics in the wheat market recently has been a focus on Egypt and whether or not it's gone back and forth on allowing wheat with ergot, even small traces, in the country. Why is that such a big deal?
Well, Egypt is the largest wheat buyer, as a single country, largest wheat buyer in the world. They do buy some wheat from us, primarily the winter wheat classes. Their major supplier right now has been the Black Sea region and parts of Europe. Both of those regions had very, very big crops, lots of bushels. Quality is kind of marginal, which is really the type of wheat that the Egyptians try and buy. And they've had this flipping back and forth between what they're going to allow, the tolerances they're going to allow for ergot. Ergot it's a problem that does show up periodically. The kind of international standard is 0.05%, which is pretty small levels, but their buying agency has flipped between having that international standard and a zero tolerance policy. And most exporters, most countries that ship into that region, they don't feel that they can reach the zero tolerance level. and because that's 0 is 0, and if any traces show up, then all of a sudden the whole cargo gets rejected. And from a seller standpoint, that's a lot of risk. So the wheat market has really been kind of jittery, trying to figure out are the Egyptians going to stay with the zero tolerance, or are they going to shift to more of the international standard? And they keep flipping back and forth, which is causing some uncertainty.
Let's transition to corn and soybeans. The harvest has just begun. What do we know about results?
Yeah, early corn results are actually a little bit disappointing. Again, very early in the season, so things can change quickly. Again, it looks like it's going to be a good crop, but the early reports are, well, it wasn't quite as good as we were expecting. On the flip side, the soybeans were better than expected. We've had a few soybean acres taken off up here, even in the northern plains. The farmers that I have talked to said, yeah, we were hoping for a good crop, expecting that, and the numbers are coming in a bit larger than they had expected. So I want to caution everybody that these are early reports. Things can change as we get into the heart of the corn and soybean country, but these are some of the issues and information that the market is now starting to chew up as we get into the harvest process.
The USDA will release its quarterly grain stocks report next Friday. What might those numbers show?
The expectation is for the general market expectation is for the corn numbers to be probably a little bit larger than what was last year. We do know that we've got some 2015 carryover that's still in the bins. The expectation is for the soybean numbers to come in a little bit lower than last year. Export pace has been very, very good for soybeans the last several months, better than most of the traders had expected. The corn number is going to be the one, in my view, that people will follow the most closely. The feed usage on corn is the one that everybody kind of struggles with, and these quarterly stocks reports are the kind of the benchmarks we use to see how fast are we feeding up the corn.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. The National Weather Service believes a good chunk of southern and eastern Nebraska could receive above normal precipitation during the month of October. The one-month outlook released last week also shows the entire state could be warmer than usual. That would fit with the recent pattern. The summer of 2016 was the 5th warmest on record, with every state in the country experiencing above average temperatures. We talked earlier this year about how the end of El Nino could transition into the beginning of La Niña, but forecasters with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration said this month the chances for La Niña conditions developing through early winter are about 40%. On Tuesday, we talked with DTN's Bryce Anderson about that possibility, but we started by asking for an update on moisture across Nebraska.
Well, the conditions for moisture going into the fall are really pretty decent across the state because we've had some fairly abundant rains, obviously, over the last 3 weeks or so. The biggest improvement has been kind of in south central Nebraska, because there was an area south of the Platte and then toward the Kansas line that had been in severe drought conditions. And over the last couple of weeks, that section of the state improved. And so we are really looking, I think, pretty favorably. And then when you go into the fall like we are, with mild temperatures, we still have some rain that's going to show up. The water year, when it gets going in October, is going to have a pretty decent start for soil moisture recharge.
What do you think the outlook is for weather conditions during harvest here in Nebraska?
I don't think that we're going to have as favorable a harvest as we would like to see, especially from about Grand Island east. There's an area of the western and the northwestern Corn Belt where forecast models have an average of 3 to 4 inches precipitation during the month of October, and that is an average, so that means, of course, we could get more than that. So I think that we are going to be seeing some occurrences where we have some delays because of wet fields, and we're also going to have, I think, some issues with just getting the grain dry into that 15-16% moisture level for corn. So I think that we're both going to have to maybe wait it out as far as getting fields firmed up, as well as having to run the dryer more than we'd like to get the moisture down for proper storage.
What do you think the outlook is for the rest of the Corn Belt?
Well, it's kind of a wide variability type thing, because you get just east of the Missouri River, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, they're likely to be even wetter than we are going to be in central and eastern Nebraska. And there's going to be some issues there. I know that in Minnesota already, they've got some problems with wet fields. Now, when you get from the Mississippi River east and then southeast toward the Ohio River, conditions really look pretty favorable. Maybe no more than a couple inches precip during the month of October. They were, of course, quite dry in Indiana and especially in Ohio. So they're already looking at a drier scenario to go into the heart of the harvest season. So that eastern corn belt is going to get along better when it comes to progress.
Let's spend some time talking about El Nino and La Nina. Tell me about the closeout of El Nino and what it means for the future here of weather.
With El Nino having run its course last spring and first part of the summer, we went through the growing season with basically near neutral conditions in the Pacific, still with some echoes of a very strong El Nino. And overall, we have to say that the growing season was favorable, even though we had some hot periods. I mean, we're looking at very good crops overall. This fall, as the Pacific transitions into a cooler water pattern, La Nina in effect, I think that we're going to be seeing variability as we go through the fall season. Then in the winter, I'm looking for above normal winter precipitation over northern Nebraska and then near to below normal elsewhere in the state with some near to below normal temperatures. But it doesn't look like La Nina is going to be a real long-lasting feature and probably could run its course by next spring, giving us pretty much near normal conditions for next growing season, and that's favorable for us.
With weather conditions that you mentioned over our winter, what will that put out for South American growing conditions?
I am cautious about how South America is going to get along, especially through the end of the year. We know in Brazil that they're trying to overcome a very stressful drought in Mato Grosso and then Northeast. That happened earlier this year in April and May. So they're going to be dealing with that. And then farther south in southern Brazil and Argentina, there is a very strong relationship between La Nina and below average precipitation. And it's those two sections of South America that are going to be key in terms of whether they have a La Nina impact or not. But if it sets in, there could be some real stress in Argentina and then through southern Brazil.
Later in the show, Al Dutcher will provide a short-term weather outlook with his forecast for the next week. As you've heard previously on Market Journal, allowing cows to graze corn stalks after harvest can provide a beneficial partnership for crop and livestock producers. University of Nebraska-Lincoln research has found no negative yield impacts to corn or soybeans the year after grazing. In fact, a location in eastern Nebraska showed a slight yield increase in soybeans after cows grazed residues. Nebraska Extension will be holding field days at 6 locations across the state beginning next week to provide more information about residue removal. Nebraska Extension Associate Dean Rick Rasby explains what attendees will be able to learn.
We have 6 cooperator sites collected data over the last 3 years. At each of the cooperator sites, they agreed to implement 3 treatments. That would be a graze treatment and then a no bale, no graze treatment, which we would consider the control, and then we have a baled treatment. And what they'll learn is that we're pretty comfortable in regards to the impact of grazing on subsequent yield. That data, as well as other data at the University of Nebraska, says there's no negative impact. And they'll learn about that and how we constructed the experiments at the cooperator sites. We've also looked at the soil attributes, and there's some interesting conversation around there. One measurement that we did make was compaction, and we can't find any compaction when we've implemented those treatments, and the grazing recommendation is based on University of Nebraska grazing recommendations.
The Corn Residue Cooperators Field Days begin next week in Ainsworth, Norfolk, Clay Center, and Odessa. They'll continue in October with locations in Nebraska City and Scottsbluff. You can find more information about the events on the Market Journal website. The National Association of State Departments of Agriculture marked its 100th year this week. At its annual meeting, the event was held in Lincoln, Nebraska, as Nebraska Department of Ag Director Greg Ibach currently serves as NASDA president. The meeting ran from Wednesday through Saturday and included tours around the state and a discussion in Omaha concerning U.S. trade. We talked with Greg on the opening morning of this year's event at the Embassy Suites in downtown Lincoln.
So NASDA is the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture, and so we have 45 states represented here this week in Nebraska. Their directors, commissioners, or secretaries, depending on their how their constitutional arrangement is. And NASDA works on policy. It works with federal regulatory bodies to be a cushion between states and feds.
Tell me about some of the policy initiatives that you're looking at specifically at this event and the implications of those.
So we're definitely looking ahead to the Farm Bill debate, which is going to start next session in Congress. There'll be hearings on it. And so NASDA is already starting to frame up, work within our own states to identify what our important priorities are, as well as then be prepared to have a NASDA overall priority list. We also work on regulatory issues like the Food Safety Modernization Act, and then trade and international development is also one of our big topic areas as well.
Can you explain how that discussion goes with 50 different states who all have different interests?
So, we do have differences. Regionally, some states specialty crops are more important too. We're part of the Midwest where commodities, corn, soybeans, and livestock are grown. In the South, you have rice and cotton interests. And so we try to figure out what the themes are that we can work on. We may not be able to come up with a commodity title agreement because of the competition between specialty crops, commodities, and rice and cotton, but we can come up with some themes that are important that help every state.
Part of the conference this year will also be touring some of these folks around Nebraska. Can you explain why you felt that was important and the few areas that they are going to or will have been to by the time this airs?
So the annual meeting is located in the state where the president is, the retiring president is, who's finishing his term is from. And so it rotates all over the United States. And we've spent a lot of time on the coasts in the most recent years. So it's really exciting to have them here in Nebraska, in the heartland of U.S. agriculture. We can show them commercial agriculture. We can show them, family farms and ranches that are successful and are of, substantial size that we can show them. And so we're really excited to do that.
The event this year, what role is the current state of the farm economy and trade discussions and a lot of the things that are happening overall across the country playing a role this year?
Definitely, the presidential candidates, both parties have rhetoric that's concerning on the trade side of things because trade is so important to agriculture. So we're working to be able to get messages to both presidential campaigns that, agriculture doesn't like what we're hearing, that trade is important. And then we're also, very concerned about, how can we do some programs that might support our farmers and ranchers this fall. We're having discussions between states of things we're doing maybe in Nebraska that they could repeat or copy in another state.
We'll have more interviews from this week's NASDA conference in future episodes of Market Journal. The September Nebraska farmer says as the growing season draws to a close, many producers may wonder where their soil moisture probes are paying off the most. This month's issue says most producers place a few probes in soybean fields but focus more on corn. You can learn more about the discussion featuring input from Central Valley Ag's team in the September Nebraska Farmer. The fourth cutting of alfalfa in Nebraska is 60% complete, near the 5-year average of 63%, but 14 points behind last year. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension forage specialist Bryce Anderson about the options for selling hay and the importance of noting the winterizing period of alfalfa plants.
Well, alfalfa plants, they tend to be able to detect how long the days are getting, and they also can feel that the temperatures are starting to decline. So around the middle part of September, the plant changes its metabolism and starts taking some of the nutrients that it's producing in photosynthesis. And instead of using those nutrients for growth, it starts transporting those nutrients down into the root and crown system, saving those nutrients then to help the plant be able to survive the winter, and then have some of those nutrients remaining in the springtime to start the spring growth. It goes through this process, for about a 4 or 5 week time period before we get to our killing freeze time period here in the fall.
How does that process affect when you should cut?
Well, we certainly don't want the alfalfa plants to be stressed excessively during that time period. So here in Nebraska, between about mid-September and mid-October, that's the primary winterizing time for these plants. Harvest during that time period can be a little bit risky, especially if the alfalfa plants have been under any kind of undue stress during that year, or during previous years due to diseases or variety selection, things of that nature that may influence how well those plants are able to withstand winter conditions.
What's the recommendation then for those growers?
Well, typically what we're going to look at is that if you're looking at trying to cut during that time period, and oftentimes we have some pretty nice hay out there at that time, we need to consider how much stress we've put on the plants. If we've been cutting them frequently, maybe we're getting into a fifth cutting, we really need to be a little bit careful in those situations about timing a harvest at that time period. If it's only a third or maybe a fourth cutting, the plants usually are in pretty good shape. They've had plenty of time to rebuild the root systems, and so they can be cut. Also, we may want to take a look at what the prices or value of that alfalfa might be. If we're going to be able to make that alfalfa hay into a high value product, maybe into the horse market or to dairy, it may be worth taking a little bit of risk. A risk that either loss of a little stand or a little lower yield during first cutting next year to capitalize on those higher prices. But if it's just going to be hay that's relatively low value, especially in a year when we have lots of hay available and don't necessarily need it for our own operation, we may be better off just letting that alfalfa go and not cutting it during that time period. After all, after the winterizing period is over, we could cut it at that time period with very little risk, or we could graze it at that time period and expect that the alfalfa will come back the next spring in real good shape.
Can you go more into the pros and cons of selling hay into this market?
When we're dealing with a market this year where the difference in price for the high value hay, for the dairy hay or the horse hay or other high value hay, may be $60, $75, $80 a ton more than for the hay that's going to be fed primarily in a feed lot or to our beef cows, that decision in terms of whether or not it's going to be worth taking that extra cut really becomes an important and valuable consideration for using that hay. And when we're going to have the opportunity to get the high value, oftentimes it can be worth going after it, even if we need our own hay. Because if we're able to sell that hay for $60, $75 more than we could buy some of the neighbors' excess hay, we can find ourselves a real easy profit gain from that without risking too much on our own alfalfa, both in terms of its stand or the feed that we're going to have available for our own livestock.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are again for the weekly forecast. But before we get to the main forecast, let's take a retrospective of the past week. And one of the things that we've seen was, over this last week, very warm temperatures moving into the region. Of course, we kind of talked about this last week as we've seen that upper air trough projected to move into the central plains as we got into the later part of the week, and in advance of that we'd pump up the warm air. Well, actually the models underplayed the intensity of that pumping of warm air up into our region, and it brought a lot of humidity levels up across to Iowa, southern Minnesota, and interacted with the frontal boundary movement across the northern United States. Therefore, we've seen some significant moisture breakout for about a 2-day period over northern Iowa, southern Minnesota, where we had totals anywhere from 2 to upwards of a foot, depending on location. We've seen severe flooding out of Minneapolis, severe flooding out of Mason City, and unfortunately it's probably going to have some significant impacts on some of the crops in this region. On top of that, we're looking at this trough moving out this weekend that's going to possibly generate some additional heavy precipitation over these areas, so we would expect to see continued flooding concerns emanate out of this region, probably looking at a very slow haul in terms of getting their harvest activity underway. Now this week we're going to introduce some new graphics to you. We'd like to thank Stoney Cooper, who is our programmer with the State Climate Office, for developing these slides. Hopefully these will make it much easier for you to follow us as we give the weather forecast. So we're going to get right away to the first example slide that we're going to use. And this will be the new upper air patterns that we're going to show. So this green area here basically is where the primary formation of the jet is, the strongest winds aloft. At the surface, you'll see these red lines. This is your surface pressures. And then the blue up here in the northwest, these lines, basically this is the thickness levels of the atmosphere. So these are the three things that we're going to be talking about consistently from this point forward. And of course, you have your surface lows and highs that we talk about in terms of direction. So as we look for today, what we notice is that we have a large trough in the atmosphere that's pumping up this moisture into our region. And this is expected to slowly grind its way toward the east. So we have a surface low to the south of us and one to the north. And that north one is going to be the one that's going to take over. We're going to see the system wrap up pretty strongly, and as we move forward, we're going to deeply intensify it, bring significant moisture to the east of us, but for us we're probably looking at just a chance for this weekend for moisture. Now this system right now is expected to generate itself over the Great Lakes region and slowly cut off and scatter around to the east of us. In the meantime, we'll be watching a trough to the west of us starting to make its way westward or eastward as we get through this week, and potentially impacting our region as we get into early October. The one fly in the ointment is that the models have been playing around with this cutoff upper low and pushing it all around. So as you see by this model, it looks like that we are going to be looking at a dry period after this weekend, and then we'll start to look at around the 3rd of October before we start to see north system come in. So in terms of radar, precipitation forecast, this is our precipitation forecast for today. Most of it will remain to the east of us, the heaviest precipitation across southeast Nebraska, and then as we go into tomorrow, you'll see this heavy line of precipitation anywhere from 1 to 3 inches, and as we go into the later part of the weekend, we start to see that sliding off to the east of us with a drying pattern in our region. This system really gets itself wound up and slowly migrates to the east. So I expect we're going to see flooding problems all the way across the eastern portion of the Corn Belt, and especially as it gets toward the eastern seaboard and starts pumping up some of that Atlantic moisture into the region. For our area, we start to turn our attention around the 1st of October to this system starting to make its way into our region, and we start to bring moisture into the Central Plains, and we would expect that this will start to intensify as we get into the Central Plains around the 5th of October, and this will start to migrate its way up into the upper Midwest and renew the flooding problems that we've seen in this region. Now in terms of the 8 to 14 day forecast, we are looking at above normal conditions from next Thursday through the following Tuesday, and in terms of precipitation, much of the upper Midwest will be above normal in terms of moisture.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on grain markets, the possibility of a switch to La Niña, the 100th annual NASDA meeting, and winterizing of alfalfa. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Next week, Mike Briggs will be our cattle market analyst, and we'll further discuss trade issues impacting agriculture. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.